Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The jungle whispered secrets to those who dared listen. It was a symphony of life, thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the hum of unseen creatures. In this emerald labyrinth, where sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, there lurked a legend older than memory itself, a tale of gold, of madness, and of those who vanished chasing a dream. They called it El Dorado, not a man nor a city, but something greater. Some swore it was a lake, its depths lined with golden offerings. Others whispered of a hidden valley where temples gleamed under the eternal sun. But all who sought it agreed on one thing: gold beyond imagination, enough to make kings of beggars and to drive men to ruin. Among those who listened to the legend was a man named Diego Valverde, a Spanish conquistador who had seen war, death, and the rise and fall of empires. But none of it compared to the hunger that burned within him when he first heard the tale. Gold, more than he could carry, more than he could ever spend. A treasure hidden in the heart of an uncharted land. In the port city of Cartagena, where the air reeked of salt and sweat, Diego assembled his expedition. He had ships, steel, and the blessing of the Spanish crown. But beyond the coastline, past the rivers and mountains, lay the unknown, and in the unknown, men were swallowed whole. As the ship set sail down the Magdalena River, Diego stood at the bow, staring into the mist. He could feel it in his bones. El Dorado was real. He would find it no matter the cost. The Magdalena River was a lifeline and a curse. It snaked through the land like a silver serpent, carrying Diego Valverde and his men deep into the heart of an untamed world. The jungle loomed over them, its thick walls of foliage breathing with the sounds of unseen creatures. Every shadow concealed a danger: poisonous insects, hidden jaguars, and men who had long forgotten the laws of civilization. Diego's expedition was not the first to seek El Dorado. He had heard the stories: ships swallowed by the river, men vanishing into the green abyss, their bones never found. Yet he was different. He had studied the maps, the faded records from previous journeys. He had spoken to the natives, bribed, threatened, and, when necessary, spilled blood. He would not turn back. They moved southward, deeper into the unknown. The sun was a distant memory beneath the jungle's canopy, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Men grew restless, their whispers turning to murmurs of doubt. Gold was a promise, but hunger and fever were real. Then came the first sign. One morning, as the mist curled over the river, a scout returned breathless, his face pale beneath a layer of sweat and mud. He led Diego to a clearing where the jungle had been swallowed by stone. Ruins, ancient, massive, half buried in vines. Carvings of strange gods stared from the walls, their eyes hollow and waiting. At the center stood a pillar, blackened by time, and at its base, half hidden in the roots of a strangling tree, was gold. A plate, small yet unmistakable. Diego's hands trembled as he lifted it, its surface cold despite the heat. The carvings on the plate were unlike anything he had seen. A-I-K-E, language lost to time, but it did not matter. Gold was gold, a murmur ran through the men. For weeks they had battled the jungle, and now in their hands was proof that El Dorado was not just a tale. But the jungle was not silent. From the depths of the trees came a sound, not the rustling of wind, nor the cries of monkeys. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Drums. The men drew their swords, their eyes scanning the shadows. They were being watched. The legend of El Dorado had drawn them in. Now something ancient had taken notice. The jungle was alive. Not with the usual hum of insects or the distant cry of howler monkeys, but with something deeper, something that sent a shiver through even the most hardened of Diego Valverde's men. The drums continued, slow and deliberate, echoing from unseen depths. The men gripped their swords, eyes darting between the twisting vines and towering trunks. The feeling of being watched tightened around them like a noose. Then, from the darkness, came movement. Shapes emerged between the trees, silent, painted figures with bodies cloaked in the jungle's green. Their eyes glowed like embers beneath the war paint, their weapons held firm but unreadable. The natives. Diego had expected them. He knew no land was ever truly empty, that the jungle had its own kings. Yet these people were unlike the tribes he had encountered before. Their silence was unnerving, their presence heavy with warning rather than fear. One stepped forward, a man draped in feathers of iridescent blue, his face half covered in golden dust. He spoke, his voice a low murmur in a tongue Diego did not recognize. The conquistador raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. He had dealt with tribes before. He knew how quickly fear turned to bloodshed. "We seek the city of gold," Diego said, his voice steady. The native did not react. His eyes, dark and ancient, seemed to study Diego as if measuring his soul. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the jungle. The others followed, melting into the shadows as if they had never been there. The silence that followed was heavier than the drums. "They let us go?" one of Diego's men whispered. Diego wasn't sure. Then they saw it, carved into the stone. Pillar just beneath where Diego had taken the golden plate. A symbol freshly cut, its edges sharp and precise. A warning, a spiral coiled like a serpent, its center marked with a single, staring eye. They were not alone on this path, and something had already seen them. Nightfall swallowed the jungle, turning it into a world of whispers and unseen eyes. The men of Diego Valverde's expedition sat close to their fires, their hands resting on hilts and triggers. The encounter with the natives had left them uneasy, but it was the symbol on the pillar, the spiraling serpent with its unblinking eye, that weighed on them like a curse. Diego sat apart, turning the golden plate over in his hands. The markings on it were ancient, worn by time yet precise, as if they carried meaning beyond mere decoration. Was it a clue, a warning, or an invitation? Sleep came in restless fragments, haunted by rustling leaves and the distant echo of drums. And then, in the heart of the night, the jungle exhaled. A sound deep and guttural slithered through the trees, not the cry of a jaguar nor the hiss of an anaconda, but something far older, something that belonged to the earth itself, one of awe. The men, a young soldier named Ruiz, bolted upright, his breath ragged. "Something is out there." The others stirred, gripping their weapons. Diego rose, scanning the darkness beyond the flickering firelight. The jungle was motionless, yet the air was thick with presence. Then came the scream. It was brief, choked, off before it could rise to full terror. The men rushed toward the sound, blades drawn, their torches casting frantic shadows against the trees. They found nothing, no footprints, no blood, just an empty space where a man had been keeping watch. The jungle had taken him. Panic set in. The men whispered of curses, of spirits that guarded the lost city. Diego silenced them with a glare. Fear was a sickness, and in the jungle, it was fatal. "We move at dawn," he ordered. No turning back. And so, they pressed on, deeper, into the unknown. By midday, the river had narrowed, its banks rising into sheer cliffs thick with vines. The heat was oppressive, pressing down like the breath of some unseen beast. Then, ahead, the jungle parted. A pathway of stone, ancient and worn, stretched into the distance. It was overgrown, yet deliberate, carved into the land itself. The path of the serpent. Diego felt it in his bones. This was no accident. This road had been made by those who came before, those who knew the secret of El Dorado. And if they had built a path, they had built it for a reason. With a silent nod, he led. His men forward, the jungle watching, closed in behind them. The path of the serpent wound through the jungle like an ancient scar, its stones cracked and worn by time. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something more elusive, something old, untouched. The deeper Diego Valverde and his men traveled, the more the jungle felt like a presence, not just a place. The men walked in tense silence, their weapons drawn, their eyes darting between the vines and twisted roots. The soldier who had vanished the night before haunted their thoughts. The jungle had taken him without a sound, without a trace. What else lurked beyond their vision? Then, as the path turned a final bend, the jungle broke open. A wall of stone loomed before them, half devoured by time, its surface carved with symbols that spiraled in endless patterns. Vines cascaded down its sides, their roots burrowing deep into cracks and crevices. The jungle had tried to reclaim it, but had not yet succeeded. At its center stood a gateway, two towering pillars, each adorned with figures locked in frozen battle. Warriors, priests, gods, or something in between. Their faces were worn smooth by centuries of rain, but their presence was undeniable. The gates of the lost. Diego stepped forward, brushing his fingers over the stone. There were no doors, only an empty archway that yawned like the mouth of a beast. Beyond it, the jungle stretched onward, yet something about it had changed. The trees grew in unnatural shapes, their trunks twisted, their roots gnarled like skeletal hands. "This is it," Diego murmured. The men exchanged uneasy glances. No bird sang beyond the gate, no insects hummed. It was as if the jungle itself held its breath. One of the men, Captain Rojas, a hardened soldier with scars from battles across the New World, placed a hand on Diego's shoulder. "We should think before we cross. There's something wrong here." Diego met his gaze. He understood the fear, but he also understood what lay beyond fear. Glory, riches, the legend itself. "We did not come this far to turn back," he said. Then, without another word, he stepped through the gate. A gust of wind rushed past them as if something unseen had exhaled. One by one, the men followed, their boots crunching against the stone. The jungle beyond was darker, its air thick like breath against their skin. The path of the serpent had led them here. Now something else was waiting, and it had been waiting for a long, long time. The jungle beyond the gates of the lost was different. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one where time had twisted upon itself, where the air was thick with memories that did not belong to them. The trees stood taller here, their trunks swollen and gnarled, their roots like skeletal hands reaching through the damp earth. The men moved cautiously, their torches flickering against the oppressive darkness. No birds called, no insects droned. The silence was unnatural, pressing against their ears like the depths of the sea. Then they heard it, a whisper. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a rustling murmur, too low to understand, too near to ignore. The men froze, gripping their weapons. Captain Rojas stepped beside Diego, his knuckles white around his sword. "Someone is here." Diego scanned the shadows, but there was no movement beyond the torchlight. Only the whisper, growing stronger, layered like the voices of the dead. Then a soldier screamed. They turned in time to see Ruiz, the youngest of them, drop his torch, his face pale as death. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at something only he could see. "They're watching," he choked. "Who?" Diego demanded. Ruiz pointed into the darkness. "The ones who came before." And then they saw them. Figures, faint, wavering like heat rising from the ground. Shapes that flickered in and out of sight between the trees. warriors in broken armor, explorers in rotting clothes, their faces hollow, their eyes endless voids, the fallen, men who had walked this path before and never returned. The whispers swelled, merging into a single shuddering voice that spoke in a tongue older than time. A warning. The torches flickered violently. A gust of wind howled through the trees, and in that instant, the figures vanished. Silence fell once more. Diego exhaled, his pulse hammering in his ears. The men were shaking, their faces slick with sweat. "We move," Diego ordered, forcing his voice to remain steady. Now, they did not question him. None of them wanted to linger in that place. As they marched forward, the jungle felt heavier, the air pressing against their skin like unseen hands. The path wound deeper, the trees growing denser, the shadows stretching long and unnatural. The legend of El Dorado had always been a tale of gold. But Diego was beginning to understand something far more terrifying. Gold was never given freely, it was paid for, and the price was always blood. The jungle pressed in tighter as Diego and his men pushed forward, their torches throwing flickering shadows along the twisting path. The encounter with the whispers of the fallen had left its mark. No one spoke, and every rustle of leaves sent hands flying to hilts and triggers, but they could not stop. The path of the serpent had brought them too far, and there was no turning back. By midday, they reached a break in the jungle, a clearing where the land sloped downward into a valley, shrouded in mist. At the heart of it, glistening under the pale light, was a river. But this was no ordinary river. The water was black as oil, sluggish and thick, and along its banks, half buried in the mud, lay bones, skulls, ribs, shattered femurs, some human, others from beasts long dead. The remains stretched as far as the eye could see, a graveyard without end. A hush fell over the men. What is this place?" one whispered. Captain Rojas knelt beside the riverbank, brushing his fingers over a skull. It was ancient, its surface worn smooth by time, but the way it was positioned, tilted upward, jaw frozen in an eternal scream, unsettled him. "This is a warning," he muttered. Diego, however, saw something else. Across the river, half hidden in the mist, stood the ruins of a bridge. Its stone arches were cracked but intact, stretching toward the unseen depths of the jungle beyond. El Dorado lay ahead. He could feel it. "We cross," Diego ordered. The men hesitated. Some muttered prayers. Others simply stared at the water as if it might rise and consume them. But gold had already poisoned their souls. The promise of riches was stronger than fear. One by one they stepped onto the bridge. The stones were slick with moisture, the mist curling around them like unseen fingers. Every footstep echoed unnaturally, the silence swallowing even their breath. Then, halfway across, the river moved. A ripple spread through the black water. Slow at first, then faster, as if something had awakened beneath the surface. A soldier named Velasco gasped, gripping the bridge's edge. "Something's down there." And then the first hand broke the surface. It was not a man's hand. It was long and thin, its fingers stretching unnaturally, the flesh pale and writhing. Another followed, and then another, until the water churned with them, a forest of grasping limbs. Velasco screamed as a hand clamped around his ankle. The river exploded. Figures burst from the depths, their bodies slick with black water, their eyes hollow and unseeing. They were men, but not men. Drowned things, cursed things, the fallen. They lunged. The bridge turned to chaos. Swords flashed, torches tumbled into the abyss. Gunshots shattered the silence. The dead did not cry out. They only pulled. Velasco was the first to vanish, yanked screaming into the depths. Another man followed, his fingers clawing at the stone, before he too was lost. Diego ran. Captain Rojas slashed at the things that reached for him, his blade meeting flesh that felt neither pain nor resistance. "Move, move," Diego roared. The remaining men bolted, stumbling across the final stretch of the bridge as the dead swarmed behind them. Then, just as the last soldier leapt onto solid ground, the bridge collapsed. The jungle shook with the sound of cracking stone. As the ancient structure gave way, plunging into the cursed river below, the dead were swallowed, their grasping hands vanishing into the black depths. Silence. The survivors stood gasping, staring at what remained of the bridge. There was no way back. The jungle had made its decision. The only path left was forward, and in the distance, rising from the mist, golden spires glinted beneath the sun. El Dorado was waiting, but at what cost? The survivors stood in silence, their chests heaving, their eyes fixed on the golden spires rising beyond the mist. The bridge was gone. The river of bones had claimed its price. There was no turning back. Diego Valverde wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand still trembling. The things in the river, the cursed dead, had nearly dragged them into oblivion, but he could not afford to think of them now. El Dorado was before him. They moved forward, stepping onto a path of white stone, smooth and polished as if untouched by time. The jungle seemed to retreat, its tangled mass giving way to towering pillars and broken archways. Then the mist parted. A gasp rippled through the men. Before them lay a city unlike anything they had ever seen. El Dorado. The ruins stretched far, and wide golden rooftops gleaming beneath the sun, temples of carved obsidian and emerald, rising from the earth. Great statues lined the avenues, warriors adorned with gold, their eyes set with black stones that seemed to follow them. The streets were paved with orichalcum, a metal brighter than gold, humming with an eerie energy. Basins of clear water reflected the sky, their surfaces unbroken by the passage of time. It was not an abandoned city, it was waiting. The men fanned out cautiously, their hands resting on weapons. Captain Rojas touched one of the walls, tracing its intricate patterns. "It's real," he whispered. The air was thick with a strange, heavy silence. There were no birds, no insects, just the occasional sigh of the wind, like the city itself was breathing. Then they reached the central. Plaza Dot, a massive golden pyramid, rose from the heart of the city, its surface smooth and blinding beneath the sun. At its peak, a great altar loomed, black with age, streaked with stains that looked far too much like dried blood. Something waited there. At the pyramid's base stood a throne, carved from jade and onyx. A figure sat upon it. It was not alive. The remains of a king clad in golden armor, his skull crowned with an intricate headdress of feathers and gemstones. His hollow eyes stared eternally ahead, his bony fingers resting on the armrests. But in his lap, gripped between skeletal hands, lay a staff of pure gold, crowned with a glowing gemstone that pulsed like a heart. "The heart of El Dorado," Diego whispered, "the treasure of legends. The key to an empire lost to time." The men stepped forward, but the earth rumbled. A deep vibration shuddered through the stones, sending dust cascading from the temple walls. The air grew thick, charged with unseen energy, and then, for the first time, a sound broke the silence, a deep, resonant heartbeat, not from the corpse, from the city itself. The golden pyramid trembled. The statues along the plaza moved, their eyes flaring with a cold, golden light. The once silent city began to hum, a chorus of forgotten voices rising in the wind. Something had awakened, something that had never truly died. And Diego Valverde understood with a terror colder than steel that El Dorado had never been lost. It had been waiting, and now it was awake. The hum of the city deepened, growing into a vibration that pulsed through the stones beneath their feet. The golden spires trembled, the statues standing along the plaza shifted, their once lifeless forms cracking as if something inside them had been trapped for centuries, waiting. The air shimmered, the very sky above darkened as if the sun itself had recoiled. Diego Valverde gripped the hilt of his sword, staring at the golden staff still clutched in the skeletal king's grasp. Heart of El Dorado, a treasure beyond value, a relic of infinite power. It was close enough to take, but something in the air, the weight of the silence, the growing hum of unseen voices, held him back. Then the first statue moved. A massive warrior, its body sculpted from obsidian and gold, its eyes burning with cold, unnatural light. It turned its head, the stone grinding like ancient gears. Then its arms rose, the jagged edges of its golden spear glinting in the dimming light, and then another moved, and another. All around the plaza, the guardians of El Dorado were awakening. A soldier named Ortega was the first to react. He lifted his musket and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the silent ruins. The bullet shattered harmlessly against the guardian's golden chest. The warrior turned its gaze to Ortega and struck. The spear pierced through him, lifting him off his feet before flinging him aside like a rag doll. His body landed in the dust, motionless. Panic exploded through the men. "Run!" Captain Rojas bellowed. The guardians charged. Blades of gold and obsidian sliced through the air, cutting down the closest soldiers before they could react. The men fired muskets, swung swords, but their weapons were useless. The guardians did not bleed, did not falter. They were not men, they were the curse of El Dorado. Diego ran, his heart pounded as he sprinted toward the pyramid, the screams of his men fading behind him. The golden steps gleamed under his boots, slick with dust and age. He did not look back. He knew what he would see. The others were dying. One by one, the men who had crossed the river of bones, who had braved the jungle and the whispers of the dead, were being erased, but Diego had not come for them. He had come for the heart. At the top of the pyramid, the skeletal king still sat, his golden headdress gleaming, his empty eyes fixed on eternity, and in his lap, the staff pulsed. Diego reached out, his fingers brushing against the smooth, ancient gold. A hand shot forward, bony fingers clamping around his wrist with impossible strength. The dead king moved, its skull tilted, and from its hollow throat, a voice whispered in a tongue older than the earth itself. A single word, a warning. But Diego did not understand. He ripped the staff free from the king's grasp, and the city screamed. The entire pyramid shook, the golden walls splintering, as if the very heart of El Dorado had been torn open. The statues below froze, their eyes turning upward, and then, for the first time in over 1,000 years, El Dorado began to crumble. The moment Diego ripped the heart of El Dorado from the skeletal king's grasp, the world around him began to unravel. The ground trembled beneath his feet, the once sturdy pyramid shaking violently as if it had been disturbed from a centuries-long slumber. The golden walls cracked, splintering like glass, as though the city itself was alive. Bleeding gold and dust, its ancient secrets spilling into the air. Diego staggered back, clutching the staff, the pulsing gemstone now burning with an unbearable light. He felt the weight of something immense closing in around him, a pressure that threatened to crush him from all sides. El Dorado was not a city of gold. It was a prison for the spirits of the damned, the guardians, the warriors made of obsidian and gold, now froze in place, their eyes glowing with an unnatural fire. They stood as silent sentinels, their weapons raised in eternal vigilance. But their movements had slowed, their once feared speed now like the dying beats of a heart. The pulse of the gemstone in Diego's hands grew faster, louder. It was not the heartbeat of the city anymore. It was the heart of something else, something that had been waiting. Diego's mind raced. The whispers of the city, the voices of the fallen, all of it. He understood now. The heart of El Dorado was not a treasure. It was a curse, an ancient force bound within the city's core. The city's destruction was inevitable. He had unleashed it. Diego! The voice, Captain Rojas, cut through the chaos. Diego spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He had forgotten. About the men, they were barely visible now, shadows against the gold-lit ruins. Only a few remained. The rest were lost to the wrath of the Guardians, their bodies scattered across the plaza, their screams buried beneath the rumbling of the city's collapse. Rojas was running toward him, his face grim. "What have you done?" "I had to take it," Diego said through gritted teeth, the weight of the staff nearly unbearable in his grip. Rojas's eyes flared with frustration. "We can't take it with us. We need to leave now, or we'll be trapped." The entire pyramid shuddered. Diego felt his legs weaken under the pressure, as if the very air itself had turned to stone. The city was dying. Its time was up. But Diego could feel something shifting inside him. The power of the heart was coursing through his veins, burning like fire, filling him. He was starting to understand. The city's end was also the end of the curse that had haunted it for millennia, the end of El Dorado. "We don't need to take it," Diego said suddenly. "We need to destroy it." Rojas blinked in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The heart. It's the key, Captain." Diego's voice was firm now, the weight of his decision settling in. "It's not a treasure, it's a trap. The gold, it's a cage. The spirits, they've been trapped here all this time. And if we leave with it, we'll take that curse with us." There was a long, agonizing silence. Then Rojas nodded. "We destroy it." They didn't have time to second guess. Diego stepped forward, raising the staff above his head, the gemstone glowing brighter than ever before. The city seemed to scream in response, its walls cracking open as if protesting the final act of destruction. But Diego felt it. He could feel the heart's pulse, like a final, desperate plea, and with one swift motion, he drove the staff into the heart of the pyramid. The ground shattered. A massive shockwave ripped through El Dorado, a violent burst of light that sent the city into complete chaos. The Guardians disintegrated into ash, the golden towers crumbling into dust, and the walls of the pyramid collapsed in on themselves. It was the end of the legend. The jungle outside roared as if the earth itself was swallowing El Dorado. And then, just as suddenly, the light faded. Silence. And when the dust finally settled, all that was left was the empty jungle. El Dorado was gone. Diego and Rojas stood amidst the ruin, their clothes torn, their faces covered in ash. They were the only ones left, and in Diego's hands the heart of El Dorado, broken and shattered, was nothing more than a handful of dust. But at least it was over, and the jungle had taken back what was once its own. The jungle was still. The echoes of El Dorado's destruction had faded, leaving only the mournful hum of the wind through the trees. The land had reclaimed the cursed city, and the faintest remnants of gold glittered among the shattered ruins. Like forgotten promises lost to time, Diego and Rojas stood in the silence of the aftermath. Their bodies were bruised, their faces hollow with exhaustion, but they had survived. They had destroyed El Dorado, ending the curse that had claimed so many lives before them. But as the weight of their actions sank in, the question loomed. What now? Rojas wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, staring out at the vast expanse of jungle that stretched before them. "We've done it, Diego. The heart is gone. El Dorado, it's vanished." Diego's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his mind racing. El Dorado's secrets were now buried with its ruins, the legend fading into the mist. But something still gnawed at him. They hadn't come to the jungle to destroy. They had come to find glory. Yet in the end, Glory had turned into ash, and the gold they had dreamed of now felt like an empty promise. What was left now? Diego? Rojas's voice broke through his thoughts. What happens now? Diego turned to face him, his face grim. We go back, he said quietly. We leave this place behind. No one else needs to suffer like we have, Rojas nodded slowly. He didn't need to ask what Diego meant. They would leave the jungle behind, return to the world they had once known, and never speak of El Dorado again. There were no riches. Here, only death, destruction, and a curse that had outlived its creators. As they began the long walk back through the jungle, the dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into jagged beams. The paths they followed seemed unfamiliar now, as if the jungle itself had changed. The walls of trees pressed in tighter, the ground beneath their boots more uncertain. The farther they traveled, the more the jungle seemed to whisper, strange sounds that came from nowhere and everywhere. The air was thick, filled with an otherworldly tension that neither man could shake. And then they reached the clearing where the river of bones had once flowed. The black water was still. The bones were gone. There were no signs of the fallen that had once haunted its depths. No whispers, no skeletal hands. The river was peaceful. Rojas stopped, looking back at Diego. You ever think about the men we lost? Diego's face softened, a fleeting sorrow passing through his eyes. Every day. We owe them everything. They wanted gold. Rojas chuckled bitterly. But all we got was ruin. Diego nodded. Sometimes the world doesn't give you what you expect, but it takes what it wants. Rojas looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. You don't think the jungle's finished with us, do you? Diego's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. The jungle felt different now, like an old memory clinging to the edges of his mind. It had changed since they first entered, and it wasn't the same place they had left behind, but it was not the jungle that worried him now. It was the deep knowing that they had crossed a line, stepped into a world of gods and ancient forces, and had come out the other side. But what had they become? I don't know, Diego said quietly, but we'll never truly escape it. Days passed, and still the jungle clung to them like a shadow, refusing to let them go. The path home was long and treacherous, a winding, relentless journey through the dense, unforgiving wilderness. The memories of El Dorado's golden ruins haunted Diego's mind like a specter. The images of the city's destruction forever burned into his thoughts. Though they had survived, it had come at a cost. The men they had lost, the spirits they had disturbed, and the strange, lingering feeling that something more had been awakened, something beyond their understanding. Rojas, ever the pragmatist, tried to keep them moving. We'll be out of this damn jungle soon, he muttered, swatting away a vine that had snaked across his path. But even his voice lacked conviction. The weariness in his tone was unmistakable, and Diego could see it too, the edge in Rojas's eyes, the shadows creeping in from the corners of his mind. They were not the same men who had entered El Dorado, but despite their exhaustion, the jungle showed no signs of release. The trees loomed higher, the underbrush more oppressive, as if the earth itself was holding them captive. The silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustling of unseen creatures and the distant cry of a bird, yet it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I don't understand it, Rojas muttered one night, sitting by their campfire. The jungle, it's alive, Diego, like it knows what we've done. Diego stared into the flickering flames, his mind drifting, back to the heart of El Dorado. He had destroyed it. He had shattered it with his own hands, and yet, a part of him wondered if it had ever truly been destroyed. The ground beneath their feet felt more unstable as they ventured deeper into the jungle. The air, thick with humidity, grew heavier with each passing hour. the closer they came to the edge of the forest, the more Diego felt that familiar pull, the same feeling he had experienced when he first set foot in El Dorado, as if the jungle were following them. The moon was high in the sky one night when they reached a clearing. Diego stopped. The trees parted in a circular opening, and in the center, a strange stone formation stood. It was small but unmistakably ancient, with carvings and symbols that mirrored those they had seen in El Dorado. Rojas drew his weapon. "I don't like this." Diego's instinct screamed to turn back, but the pull was stronger now, an undeniable force that beckoned him forward. His feet moved of their own accord, leading him toward the formation. As he stepped closer, air grew thick, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. The stone formation seemed to whisper, its markings shifting and changing, as if alive. The symbols seemed familiar, words he thought he had seen etched on the walls of El Dorado. And then the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the jungle like the growl of a great beast awakening from slumber. "Diego," Rojas called out, his voice tight with fear. "What's happening?" Before Diego could respond, the air shifted and the ground split open. The earth buckled and cracked, and a great chasm opened before them, an abyss of blackness that seemed to stretch into infinity. A cold wind poured out from the depths of the earth, carrying with it a voice that Diego had heard before. "You cannot escape." It was the voice of the city, the voice of El Dorado. The air grew colder still, and Diego felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him. The very ground beneath them seemed to be alive, as if it were waking from a long slumber, angry at being disturbed. "Rojas, we need to move," Diego shouted, grabbing his comrade's arm. But Rojas was frozen, his eyes wide with fear as the darkness crept ever closer. And then, from the chasm, something rose. A figure, cloaked in shadows, moved with unnatural speed. Its eyes were glowing with a pale light, and its body seemed to shift and bend with an